Glasgow's River Clyde once measured just 15 inches deep, yet it split a growing city into two worlds, each locked to its own bank by geography rather than choice. The rivalry between Rangers and Celtic was not born from football or from faith, but from a physical line that defined where people could live and where they could work, as the population exploded from 30,000 to over 200,000. The story you think you know hides an even deeper divide. How did a shallow river become the invisible boundary between these two giants, and what in the end keeps that line from ever truly disappearing? The River Clyde runs 106 miles across Scotland, but in Glasgow it takes on a different meaning. Here the river stretches anywhere from 40 to 100 meters wide as it cuts through the city. In 1755 it was measured at just 15 inches deep at low tide, barely enough to cover a boot, yet more than enough to stop a crowd. The banks were muddy, the water slow, and the channel unpredictable. Even so, the Clyde was never something people could simply wade across. Its width put real space between the north and south banks, turning a shallow stream into a stubborn barrier. Before engineers dredged the channel or built up the quays, the river geometry shaped daily life. Only one bridge spanned the Clyde in the mid-18th century, and it sat near the city centre. For everyone else, the river's 40 to 100 metre breadth meant a journey. Ferries were few, unreliable, and often expensive for working families. With no trams, no subway, and only a handful of crossings, the river forced people to live close to work, close to the mills or shipyards that lined its banks. The Clyde's 15-inch depth at low tide sounds trivial, but the reality was a muddy, shifting bed that could trap carts, drown livestock, and turn a shortcut into a day's detour. Maps from the early 1800s show neighborhoods pressed right up to the water's edge. Streets ran out at the river, and then nothing. No bridge, no easy crossing, just a wide, shallow channel that kept each side to itself. As Glasgow's population ballooned from 30,000 to over 200,000, the river's basic dimensions held firm. The width did not shrink to fit the city's needs. Instead, the city grew around the Clyde's stubborn shape, with homes, factories, and churches clustering on either side. The numbers tell the story: 106 miles long, up to 100 meters wide, just 15 inches deep in places. But those measurements translated into something more than geography. They set the boundaries of daily life, where a person could work, where a child could go to school, which church a family would attend. The Clyde was not a metaphor. Its scale was a fact, measured in footsteps and lost hours, in the distance between one world and the next. By the early 1800s, Glasgow's growth was relentless. In just 3 decades, the city's population soared from 30,000 to over 200,000. Yet the Clyde remained stubbornly short of bridges. Most days, the working class had no choice but to walk, sometimes for miles, just to reach their jobs. The city centre offered the only reliable crossing, and even that came at a price. Bridge toll records from the period show daily fees that could eat into a labourer's already meagre wages. For many, paying to cross the river was a luxury. The vast majority simply stayed on their own side. Census returns from the 1830s and the 1840s reveal a city divided not by preference, but by necessity. A textile worker in Calton or Bridgeton might live within a 15-minute walk of the mill, while a shipyard hand in Govan rarely strayed far from the docks. The few footbridges that did exist, like the old Bishop's Bridge or the Jamaica Street crossing, were often narrow, crowded, and until late in the 19th century, tolled for every crossing. Municipal records show that bridge proposals were fiercely debated for years, with costs and shipping interests slowing progress. Even as new spans like the Victoria Bridge opened in the 1850s, the number of crossings lagged far behind the needs of a booming industrial city. Walking was the only option for most. Tram lines and railways would not reach across the river until the late 19th century, and ferries ran at unpredictable intervals, charging fares that could double on busy days. For a factory girl in Parkhead or a shipwright in Govan, the river was a daily calculation: pay the toll, risk the ferry, or simply settle as close to work as possible. Diaries from the era mention lost hours waiting for a boat, or trudging home in rain when the ferry was shut for repairs. Employers too understood the limits. Job ads routinely specified the side of the river, and few workers dared to apply for positions across the Clyde. unless they had family nearby to stay with. The result was a city where neighborhoods grew dense and insular, streets pressed up against the water's edge, but few families crossed the divide. The river's geography dictated not just where people lived, but how they moved, who they met, and which communities they called their own. Over decades, these patterns set the foundation for two distinct worlds, each shaped by the simple, stubborn fact that crossing the Clyde was never easy and rarely free. In the spring of 1847, the city's docks and quays filled with the sound of foreign voices. Ships from Ireland unloaded their human cargo, men, women, and children fleeing hunger and fever. That year alone, passenger lists recorded nearly 50,000 Irish arrivals in Glasgow, most of them desperate to escape the famine that had emptied villages across Donegal, Derry, and Tyrone. With little money and few prospects, these families followed the river inland, searching for any place they could afford to stay. The East End, Calton, Bridgeton, Parkhead became their landing ground, not by design, but by necessity. Textile mills and foundries offered the only jobs available to unskilled newcomers, and the rents in the East End's new tenements, though high for their quality, were lower than anywhere else in the city. Rooms meant for 4 or 5 would sometimes shelter 20. Public health inspectors counted entire families sleeping on straw in windowless corners, with buckets for toilets and water fetched from shared wells in the street. In some buildings, a single staircase served dozens of homes, and the air hung thick with the smell of coal, sweat, and boiled cabbage. By the 1860s, reports from the city's sanitary officers described outbreaks of typhus and cholera sweeping through these blocks, with mortality rates far higher than in the better-built neighborhoods south of the river. Despite the hardship, the newcomers built a network of solidarity. Chain migration brought cousins, uncles, and neighbors from the same Irish parishes to settle on the same streets. Parish registers from St. Mary's in Calton, opened in 1842, and Sacred Heart School in Bridgeton tracked baptisms and burials that mapped entire Irish counties onto the East End grid. The church became the anchor of daily life, offering not just worship, but charity, schooling, and a sense of belonging in a city that often saw the Irish as outsiders. Relief committees and dinner tables fed children whose parents worked 12-hour shifts in the mills. School logbooks from Sacred Heart note classes packed with Irish surnames, while parish minutes record collections for families who had lost everything but their faith. Tenement life was unforgiving. Rent collectors came weekly, and failure to pay could mean eviction with no warning. Yet even in the most crowded closes, families found ways to help each other, watching children, sharing food, and pooling coins to bury the dead. The sense of community was not a luxury, but a survival strategy. Solidarity was forged in hardship, in the shared struggle to make a home where the city's geography and economy had left little choice. For the Irish of the East End, the river was not just an obstacle, it was the edge of a world, pressed tight against the promise and the limits of Glasgow itself. In 1841, Robert Napier opened a shipyard on the south bank of the Clyde, laying the groundwork for an industrial powerhouse in Govan. Napier became known as the father of Clyde shipbuilding. Within decades, the yards along this stretch of river employed thousands. By the late 19th century, the Fairfield shipyard alone counted over 5,000 men on its payroll. The air in Govan rang with the sound of hammers and rivets, while cranes dotted the skyline. These were not just jobs, they were lifelines pulling entire families into the orbit of the shipyards. The yards demanded loyalty and discipline. Skilled laborers, many from families with deep roots in the area, passed their trades down through generations. Wages here ran higher than in the textile mills across the river, and the housing stock was sturdier, with rents averaging around £5 a year. Govan's tenements, though crowded, offered better sanitation and lower disease rates than the cramped blocks of the East End. For many, the shipyards were more than a workplace. They were a source of pride and a badge of belonging on the South Bank. Govan's social life revolved around the rhythms of the yards. The workday started at dawn, with streams of men pouring through the gates in flat caps and heavy boots. After hours, the pubs filled with talk of ships and wages, and the local churches, like Govan Old Parish with its medieval origins, hosted baptisms, weddings, and funerals for families who had known no other home. Records from the period show that most workers rarely ventured far from the docks. The river, with its few crossings and unpredictable ferries, kept the community tightly bound to its side of the city. By the 1830s, the Orange Order had established a strong presence in Glasgow, with at least 12 lodges meeting regularly. Many shipyard workers joined these lodges, drawn by a sense of fraternity and shared tradition. Orange halls became gathering places for marches, celebrations, and social events, reinforcing a Protestant identity that was as much about community as it was about faith. For the Govan workforce, these institutions offered stability in a world shaped by industrial booms and busts. The shipyards themselves shaped more than just paychecks. By the 1890s, 2/3 of all British ships were built on the Clyde, and Govan stood at the center of this achievement. Yard payrolls, church rolls, and lodge membership lists often overlapped, tying together work, worship, and social life. Families grew up knowing their fortunes depended on the next contract or launch, and their loyalties ran deep to the yards, to the parish, and to the traditions that had taken hold along the South Bank. In Govan, the river was not just a barrier. It was the edge of a world built on steel, sweat, and solidarity. The Clyde's stubborn width kept the community close, making the shipyards not just an employer, but the heart of a distinct and enduring way of life. Brother Walfrid, a Marist brother teaching at Sacred Heart School in Bridgerton, watched children arrive for class with empty stomachs. In 1887, 40 years after the famine, hunger still stalked the East End. He gathered parish leaders in St. Mary's Church Hall on November 6th and proposed something unusual: a football club, not for sport alone, but to raise funds for the poor children's dinner table. In that first year, the club's efforts paid for 48,500 dinners and over 1,000 breakfasts, turning football into a lifeline for the community. Across the city, 4 teenagers, Moses McNeil among them, had founded Rangers 15 years earlier. Inspired by a rugby team they had read about, their aim was simple: to play the game. The club welcomed players of any background, with early teams including Catholics and Protestants side by side. There was no policy, no exclusion, just a shared love of football. The founding was sporting and inclusive in its intent. When Celtic and Rangers first met on the pitch in May 1888, the match was billed as a friendly. Celtic won 5-2, and the match report spoke of good spirits and mutual respect. In these early years, football in Glasgow was more about bringing people together than driving them apart. The clubs grew out of their neighborhoods, shaped by the needs and hopes of the people who lived there, not yet divided by lines of rivalry. The emphasis then was community rather than conflict. In 1912, Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipbuilding giant, took control of Govan's shipyards. The company brought more than new machinery. It brought hundreds of Ulster workers, many steeped in Orange Order traditions and accustomed to the sectarian lines drawn in Belfast yards. Govan's workforce, already tied to Protestant identity, absorbed these new arrivals. The social and industrial climate on the South Bank grew even more insular. By the 1920s, Rangers Football Club, rooted in this shipyard community, became known for an unwritten rule. In practice, Catholic players were not signed. No formal policy was ever published, but the pattern was clear, and it persisted for nearly 70 years. The only public break came in 1989, when Graham Souness signed Mo Johnston, a Catholic and former Celtic player. That decision sent shockwaves through Glasgow, and it ended a tradition that had shaped the club's identity for generations. Yet the divide was not just cultural or religious, it was etched into the city's map. Celtic Park, with a capacity of 60,832, still stands in Parkhead, the heart of the East End's Irish Catholic community. Ibrox, seating 51,700, anchors Govan on the South Bank. The stadiums are separated by 4 or 5 miles, and more importantly, by the river that shaped their origins. These grounds remain physical fossils, evidence of how industry, migration, and the Clyde's geography hardened 2 separate worlds into enduring symbols. Today, the River Clyde is easily crossed, but the old boundaries linger in memory, culture, and rivalry. Glasgow's neighborhoods are more diverse than ever, yet the line drawn by geography still echoes on match days and in identity. Understanding this history means seeing division not as fate, but as consequence. The city's future depends on what we choose to build across that line. Join the conversation below.